Okay, so this little video here is all about the Milgram experiment. I'm not really sure how many times it's been repeated since it very first came out, but I'm really just talking about first time the basics behind it. So Milgram wanted to know really what kind of people humans kind of were. He sits at his lab, gets a bunch of volunteers, and puts them to his little test. It's a pretty simple experiment. You get one guy, call him a teacher, sit him in a room with a list of questions to ask. He sits in front of a microphone and reads each question aloud. We place a second guy, the student, sitting in a room right across from him, completely blocked off. You can't see anything. And he answers the questions. When he gets a question wrong, the teacher then gives him a shock. Not so bad, right? Except these questions are a little ridiculous, and each time he gets shocked, voltage goes up. In some cases, it can reach extremely dangerous levels. Now, I know what you're thinking, that this can't be right, it can't be fair, it can't be moral, and it's not, especially not nowadays. Back then, they didn't really understand, what kind of trauma you can inflict on someone. See, now we have these rules to follow when doing experiments, especially when they involve people. And the whole point is basically just that, you can't harm anybody in any sort of way, and that includes psychologically, which you can tell was obviously the problem with Milgram's experiment, because the amount of trauma placed, here could have been incredible, and most likely was. And you see, the real question is why didn't he just stop? What was it that made him continue to go? There's this one little catch. See, the teacher was actually the one being tested because the learner wasn't getting shocked. It was a dummy switch. He really wasn't hooked up, and a lot of people believe that he was a paid actor. You've got response time. You can't just stick anybody in there, in my personal opinion. But the real thing that made the teacher continue was that there was another person involved. Let's just call him a doctor. He could have been a professor, an instructor, but it doesn't really matter because he was nothing more than a regular guy in a lab coat with a clipboard in one hand, patiently and just sitting there, basically just observing the whole thing. See, the Milgram experiment was nothing more than obedience. Some modern day examples are, the My Lai massacre in Vietnam in the 1960s. You get a general who orders his men to just slaughter this entire village. And we're talking men, women, children, elderly, everybody's just dead. And then you've got, back in Nazi Germany, the Nuremberg trial, those men were all just saying they were following orders. And that happens a lot nowadays. If someone in the military or, anything like that, if something happens, they're just like, oh, I was just following orders. And that isn't a valid excuse. And if I remember correctly, back then it wasn't either. And the whole point here is to show that under certain contexts, what kind of people are we? What socially are we able to do? And are we able to torture and harm those people just because someone tells us to? And I don't really picture myself as a very obedient person. I'm sure plenty of people out there would agree, they wouldn't think they were either. But thinking about this is, I sort of do really wonder, what about my friends and my family? What am I willing to even do for my country? And Milgram came to this conclusion that humans in general are a fairly dangerous race. We're robotic. We follow orders, we listen, we don't think for ourselves a whole lot. Is kind of the point he was trying to make. And that really got me thinking, is that, what kind of a person am I? And am I willing to be a leader? Am I willing to stand up and say no? Or am I just going to be another guy in Milgram's experiment? I'm just going to stand there and I'm going to take the orders.